Hello, welcome back to Unschooled Theology. I'm one of your hosts, Derick. With me is Evan. Hello, good sir.
How are we doing, good sir?
Pretty good, pretty good. Let's
Excellent.
let's jump right in it today. We are continuing with Genesis 1:28 here, where God gives some instructions to humanity that He has just created. And so, last episode we talked about the be fruitful and multiply,
Mhm.
and fill the earth, basically. And here we have up next, subdue the earth.
Mhm.
And this is, I think, there is a lot packed in to this command, and it seems to be one that I don't. It's forgotten, diminished. It's not one
Mm,
we talked previously about. Go forth and make disciples of all the earth. The Great
correct.
Commission, and I feel particularly perhaps in Protestantism, we treat that as though it's kind of the only command. um, Whereas I think these commands still stand here for humanity. I don't see any reason why the fall of Adam and Eve, if you will, and I don't that in the future as to why. Um, I don't think that negates any of this. Uh,
No, I don't think so. I think there's a tendency though for people to remember what's most recent. And so if
yeah,
we're if
yeah,
we're looking at it chronologically, and plus in modern churches, there's definitely a tendency to overemphasize what is in the New Testament rather
yeah.
than what is in the Old Testament. And so it's understandable that these things are forgotten, I guess.
Right, right. But that's why we're here. We're gonna draw some attention to it, I suppose.
Excellent.
Um, but I think this really is the command. This is where God tells us specifically uh, to continue with the creative and ordering process that He has
Mm,
established throughout Genesis 1. This ties very much to the idea of being the image of God within creation.
mhm.
And this command right here is one of the primary ways we can sort of perpetuate that ordering process. It's one of the primary ways in which we sort of take on that image of God
Mm,
um, within creation. And so for real quick here, let's just look quickly at this word, this subdue word here. One of the other ways you'll see it translated throughout the Bible is the idea of bringing something into bondage,
mm,
which is interesting. And so you could look at this as basically saying we're meant to bring the world into a kind of bondage
mm,
and not let it run free and wild. That bondage, though, is not a bondage to us, it's a bondage to God's design and order.
mm.
So we're bringing it into a bondage not for our own benefit and our own desires, but for the way it fits within God's design and His order for the world.
Yeah.
Uh, Obviously, the more our interests are aligned with God's, then it is bringing it into both, I guess, in a sense. But the
Yeah.
the the subduing it is meant for that.
That's so interesting because we've talked a lot about the way in which the God's creative process has gone through. And we've talked a lot about chaos and order and kind of the ordering of things that God tends to do, and subduing and especially putting something into bondage. If you try to put something in order, you do have to restrain it in order to align it in a very
Mm-hmm.
particular way. Um, and so that makes sense that would be what continuing with God's creative process looks like for humanity. It might not be conjuring up things that have not existed before, but more of a maintenance role that's
Right,
going along.
right, yeah,
Yeah, that's
yeah.
interesting.
Uh, so if we look at this as a command from God to further this process of ordering creation, ordering the earth, the obvious follow up would be, well, how do we do this? um, and that's not necessarily spelled out here. I think we'll get more of how we're supposed to do this throughout the Old Testament, but there are some things that we can just look at what God's done thus far and sort of understand a bit from that. And so the first thing I see when I look at this idea of subduing things is that this is a command to materialistic inquiry. We've talked about, material and functional and spiritual. And obviously you can't subdue something unless you have some understanding of what it is.
Mm-hmm.
You can't bring it into bondage. How are you going to bond something if you don't understand how it could be bonded? And so, in a way, in the modern world, this is the scientific method or scientific process is sort of the main way in which we do this, right? And that's sort of the means of materialistic inquiry that we see today. So, in a sense, we see here a command towards science. The first step in ordering things properly is understanding what they are, and we must understand how things work and discover those connections. And this is, in a sense, what science does. And so we should, as Christians, actually have a strong interest in science.
So it's for a functional purpose of subduing the earth.
Yeah, there's a purpose behind it for sure, and we'll get to that in a second here. But just we should have a curiosity about the material world, and at times I think Christianity throughout history has operated in ways where the materialistic world has been something that should be shunned. It should be pushed aside. You have kind of a asceticism type thoughts where we try to separate ourselves from it as much as possible. Certainly the Gnostic movements has some of that as well. And in our modern version of that, I guess, it's not that we go quite as far as those past ways of thinking about it, but we have a sense in where the modern Christian has at times an antagonistic relationship with science. I think because, frankly, misunderstandings of Genesis 1 and young earth creationism and has led to this sentiment where we feel like science is somehow disproving God in a way. It's taking away the miraculous or something. I don't think it's doing that myself. I think, in fact, as you uncover how the design works, to me, the designer becomes all the more miraculous, in a sense, and all the more amazing. Once you see that, if you see the design, you appreciate just what went into designing that thing. But
that becomes interesting, because then in order to understand how to subdue the earth, you need to take an honest look at what science has to say, and so in order to enact this commandment, you need to be more open to the things that are being discovered about the materialistic world and understand what reality looks like from those perspectives in order to keep yourself in line with God's command. And if you're ignoring them or foolishly casting them aside, then you are making it almost impossible for you to follow the second command that God gives to humanity.
Yes. Although there's in a sense a limit to that too, right? Because we understand as Christians too, we're flawed people, and so our materialistic understandings at times are limited, and we don't. Science can make greater claims than perhaps it has a right to at times, or the scientists can do that.
Correct, but you can only distinguish if a claim is greater than it should be if you understand the claim intimately.
Right, exactly. Yes. And so that is where we might approach it with a skeptical eye, but a skeptical eye out of a desire to have a strong understanding of the materialistic way of things. Too often, I think there is a Christian skepticism towards the science, almost out of like a superstition, or like we view it like a witch or something. You know, there's like this weird like mystical skepticism of it, but instead we should have a skepticism of it because we so deeply desire to find the correct answer. Not because we presume that's what it is. We presume to already have the correct answer. And so that creates a level of skepticism, but our skepticism should be based in such a deep desire to discover the right answer.
Yeah. I think that response, though, to reviewing it as witchcraft isn't unreasonable, because I think the new atheists of the past 4 decades made a major blunder by attempting to position themselves as the opposite of religion. And so when we talk about people like Hitchens and who else? Some of these other Dawkins, Hitchens and Dawkins and people like that they've positioned themselves as contrarians to religion when they should have positioned themselves as something almost in a different category.
Right.
Because it's a different way of understanding. It's not contrarian. It's just a different thing. And one of the issues that we've run into then is we have, very relevant to nowadays, is people who say, I believe in science. And it's like, well, right. Science isn't something that you believe in or don't believe in. It's a way of trying to attain more knowledge, or as much as we can attain things that we might say are material facts. And it's not a faith system. And so for a Christian nowadays to view science in the abstract as being almost a religious system isn't that far off, because it does have people who ascribe to it as though it were a religious system.
They definitely treat it as such. Yeah.
And so what we end up having is, on both sides, we have a misunderstanding of the thing that we're actually talking about. And so potentially something like this does rein in that perspective on what science should be, is that it has a function and it is a means to a potential ends. And so science is an attempt to better understand the material world in which we exist in order for, say, the Christian to subdue it.
Right. And that actually gets to sort of the next level of this, right? Because merely understanding it is not enough. This command pushes us a little bit further than that, because to subdue something, again, is about taming that thing. And so this is where the sort of the new atheists, they making science a religion in some ways does make a little bit of sense, because they realize that just the understanding is not enough. It's about what do you do with that understanding. The problem is they try to derive what you're supposed to do with it from the thing itself, kind of like in this bottom-up way. The materialistic, the more we understand the materialistic, then we'll understand how better to use it. And that's not the right way. Instead, we've talked about this idea of the spiritual meeting the material, and that being the proper functional way things should work. And so for the Christian, it's about understanding the material so that we can, using our spiritual understanding as well, bring it into that proper order that God has fashioned out of things. So it requires not just an understanding of how these things work, but how these things affect all other things. The proper order that God has designed. Once one thing is behaving properly, it will not disrupt the other things. It'll all fit together, if you will, kind of like the gears of a clock, right? That would be the perfect order of creation. And we will see a little bit why that is when we get to what happens with man and woman in the garden. And what God tells Adam is, hey, you're going to work the land, but now as a result of your sin, you'll have to deal with weeds and thorns and those kind of things. and the idea being an absence of sin, with things workingly in the proper order, and sin is as we'll see, just using things outside of their proper order. Um, in absence of that, you won't have the weeds, you won't have the thorns. Things will fit together and work properly. And so that is, as a Christian, that should be sort of the foundation of our scientific inquiry, is a desire to understand the material so that we can know how to properly apply the spiritual principles to the material world.
Mm-hmm.
And that's sort of a functional implementation of everything. And that's what I see this idea of subduing the earth is calling us to that.
Mm-hmm. Excellent.
All right. Okay, and so that's basically what I see as behaving in the image of God. Because if we look throughout Genesis 1, that is what he has done here. He's brought sort of the spiritual ideas to bear upon the materialistic world that he's created. So
that presents an interesting idea then, yeah. And I think the image of God is interesting then, because we've interpreted this for the most part. The first few verses of Genesis and the creation story almost as a template in understanding how humanity is intended to function, to get a better idea of what ordering things looks like, what the creative process looks like for humanity. What are we intended to do? And these couple of passages here then saying that we are commanded to subdue the earth and then we are created in the image of God. Those two in combination really kind of validate that interpretation. It makes you say, okay, it is reasonable for us to look back and not just say that this is the way that God functions, but perhaps that this is the way God is intending us to function too, that he's demonstrating out what the creative process looks like.
Yes.
And the subduing process looks like.
Right. Because he does both create and subdue. He creates light and then brings it into bondage with the greater light and the lesser light and the stars, And
with the bara creation.
Yes.
The idea of bara creation being, which if you're just jumping in now, bara means to, does it mean to kind of prune something? To cut down?
It means to create, but it has a couple other meanings to it. One of them is, this idea of selecting or to trim and cut down. And so God has the infinite possible ways that he could order creation. He has selected or cut out this particular design from the infinite.
That's fascinating. And so that feels like that associates then with potentially our role in subduing it as we continue something along the lines of that bara creation.
Yes. All right, so just the main thing I want to leave then with this episode is that that as Christians, we should take more than a passing interest in the fields of science, and actually more specifically, I think this is almost a call for Christians to be leading in the field of the sciences, and more specifically what to do with scientific understanding, right? And how do we interpret new scientific understanding, and then what application should we layer upon that better understanding of science?
I think that's entirely fair. I think it's forgotten too quickly that the scientific revolution and enlightenment came out of Western Europe, which was the center of Christendom at the time, which was the center of Christianity at the time. And that many of the early pioneers in all of those ways of understanding were believers. And I don't think it wouldn't, if someone were to look at the historical context of those two places, it wouldn't always be obvious that it would have come out of Western Europe. It would have been more likely for it to have come out of China at the time. And that is, I think that's significant, because I think that there is something that's different with a Confucian way of thinking versus versus the Christian way of thinking that leads to an impetus for curiosity. And people, I mean, in this sense, are almost commanded to take an active interest in the material world around us. And I think we've forgotten that in the Christian community, and we've especially because of new atheism and because of evolution being the great boogeyman of science, has caused us to look at the world through an incorrect lens and to say, okay, well, science must be evil then. There must be something inherently wrong with it, as opposed to saying, no, we are intended to really be at the forefront of those fields.
Yeah. Instead, we see such a focus on and desire on a new heaven and a new earth. We look at this materialistic packaging as something to endure and get through and almost despise in ways, and not really truly appreciate. And I see this here calling us to an appreciation of it, and a sense in which understand this because we'll understand God better, and in a new heaven, new earth, a dynamic, sure, we might understand him even better than we can here, but that doesn't mean while we're here, why not devote ourselves to understanding him as much as we can now as well, not just sort of, wait for the future in that sense.
Correct. And I should clarify too, there's no shortage of instances in which, most notably the Catholic Church going through the Middle Ages restrained scientific advancements.
For sure.
And restrained understanding. And I think as the church, we should look at that very closely, because we should look at that we have both sides here, and we have a tendency, there's a tendency to be at the forefront, but there's also a tendency to be holding everything back. And so understand that what the reasonings are for both. Because I think if you're looking at the Catholic Church at that time, they're holding things back because they don't want their power taken away as an institution, because it's a threat to that. And so it makes me wonder why modern Christians are so afraid of scientific understanding or incorporating it or better understanding it, because I'm concerned about the motivations. Does that potentially feel like it's a power hit for the church?
Yeah, you bring up the idea of it relating to power, and that's very interesting, right? That an understanding of the material gives power or contains power, And
that's sense, interesting. Okay,
that is interesting because all power in the end comes from God. Now, as humans, we have a choice with what to do with it, but power comes from God. And so in a sense, God has given us this source of power, and we as Christians should have a curiosity in that and say, hey, this contains a sense of power to it. Let's really think about how we should be using that. And we should want to be a part of that public discussion. And have, some influence, or at least an ability to speak about it, right? And say, look, morally speaking, or whatever, here is how we would think about this power being used. But we can't be a part of that discussion if we're not attempting to understand that science or that materialistic understanding of the world.
I mean, all the more significant that Christians would take part in it, because they have potentially a direction for it to go in. Because if you have something powerful that you can use, you need to, it's the Spider-Man quote, with great power comes great responsibility, but then completely forfeiting that responsibility leads to major issues, which is, I mean, at minimum is directionless, and at the worst could be direction towards an evil end. And
Right.
so, as Christians, it is significant then that we should take part in the conversation, because we have a direction to point those things towards. And in this context, it's subduing the earth in the proper way. And so,
Yeah,
understanding the proper way in which to incorporate the material understandings.
And because all good references eventually go to the Nazis, in a sense, this is what Bonhoeffer has to say a little bit about the Nazi uprise. And then, I mean, there was no culture of the era that, or at least government, let's say, of the era that placed a greater value on science and the power that could emerge from a scientific understanding.
Correct.
And he, more or less, I think, puts together the argument that as the Nazis were rising to power, and as they were, frankly, you know, we can look at it now and say making use of scientific understanding in new ways.
Yeah.
That the Christians in the country sat back too much, you know, and didn't participate in that conversation in the way they should have. And this is more or less what he is coming to say in his reflections on the situation. And so that I think is useful for today. Let's put it that way. As we have become a culture that more and more West values science, and as we're watching power emerge from that, it would benefit humanity as a whole, not just Christians, for us to not retreat from that conversation, but rather to deeply involve ourselves within it.
Correct. So. That's excellent. That's an excellent point.
Alrighty, with that, we'll wrap this one up. Be sure to like, subscribe, follow, review, rate, all of those kinds of things. And we'll be back again next time as we continue along and still in the same verse. So we will see you then.